The wind howled with murderous intent as two blue-skinned sisters stumbled through knee-deep snow. Dina whispered, "It hurts, Flo," her voice barely audible over the storm. Florence gripped her sister tighter, vowing to keep them alive. Ahead lay a dark, abandoned medical station, their only hope against Tarnell's lethal cold. But inside, the silence was deeper than expected, the life support failing. What they discover there will change everything about their survival. The cerulean tone of their skin told a story of biological necessity rather than aesthetic choice. Every breath on Tarnell carried microscopic toxins that would choke an unprepared respiratory system, forcing their bodies to engage in constant filtration. This process deposited minute mineral compounds just beneath the epidermal layer, creating the distinctive blue pigmentation that marked native inhabitants. Florence recalled her mother's calm explanation years earlier, her fingers tracing the blue patterns on Florence's forearm, as she described how their bodies converted poison into protection. The memory surfaced now as she watched Dina struggle through the snow, her sister's skin taking on a worrying grayish cast at the edges. That pallor signaled more than cold. It revealed a system pushed beyond its limits, filtering toxins while battling starvation and exposure. Their coloration created a dangerous visibility against Tarnell's endless white landscapes, turning them into moving targets for any predator or observer. Florence kept them close to rock formations and ice formations whenever possible, using the terrain's occasional blue mineral deposits as imperfect camouflage. Each exposure in open ground felt like walking through a shooting gallery, their skin screaming their presence across the snow. Dina's deteriorating condition showed in the way her skin lost its vibrant cerulean hue, fading toward the color of old bruises. The change happened gradually at first, then accelerated as their situation grew more desperate. Florence watched the transformation with growing dread, recognizing it as a visual chart of their declining chances. The body's filtration system was compromising, prioritizing survival functions over aesthetic consistency. This biological adaptation meant they belonged to Tarnell in ways off-world colonists never could. Their cells had rearranged themselves across generations to accommodate the planet's harsh chemistry, creating a people fundamentally altered by their environment. The blue skin represented both their deep connection to this world and their vulnerability within it, a permanent marker of adaptation that could either ensure their survival or guarantee their destruction. They neared the medical station. Florence noted how Dina's breathing patterns had changed, becoming shallow and rapid. The gray tinge around her lips and fingertips indicated oxygen deprivation, her body struggling to process even the limited air available. Each wheezing breath represented another failure in the system that kept them alive on this world. Another step closer to complete shutdown. Their mother's research had suggested the coloration could intensify under stress, the body producing more pigment compounds as it worked harder to filter toxins. Florence saw evidence of this now in her own hands, the blue darkening to near purple where her skin met the cold air. It was a visible indicator of their escalating crisis, a biological alarm system screaming for relief that might not arrive in time. The sisters represented living proof that humanity could adapt to even the most hostile environments, but at a cost that written reports never captured. Their bodies had rewritten their own genetic instructions to survive, creating children who looked alien to their ancestors, but perfectly suited to their world. That adaptation now teetered on the edge of failure, their distinctive coloration telling a story of both miraculous survival and impending collapse. The greenhouse air filtration system cycled on with its usual low hum that afternoon, circulating the scent of damp earth and genetically modified vegetation. Jasmine worked beside her assistant, carefully documenting the progress of a hybrid grain specimen that showed promise in Tarnell's mineral-heavy soil. The plant's leaves had developed a waxy coating to retain moisture, its roots deeper and more aggressive than any Earth-native variety. She noted the adaptation in her log, her fingers leaving faint smudges on the touchscreen. The containment breach began without warning. A pressure sensor failed during a routine environmental adjustment, creating a minor vacuum in the experimental zone. The stress triggered a defense mechanism in the modified plants that nobody had predicted. One specimen released a cloud of fine neurotoxic pollen, its particles so small they bypassed the primary filtration membranes. The emergency seals should have engaged immediately, but a maintenance override from the previous week had disabled the automatic response protocol. Jasmine reacted before the alarms even sounded. She shoved her assistant toward the emergency exit, her palm striking the young man's back with enough force to send him stumbling into the safety corridor. The pollen cloud expanded through the research bay, catching the light like golden dust motes in the artificial sunlight. Jasmine inhaled deeply as she reached for the manual containment controls, her body already absorbing the lethal particles. Her last actions were methodical, despite the spreading paralysis. She sealed the research samples in their protective cases, her movements growing sluggish as the neurotoxin attacked her nervous system. Her final transmission to the observation deck contained specific instructions about preserving the seed banks and research data. The message ended with a sharp cough, then silence. Florence watched from above through the reinforced observation glass, her small hands pressed against the transparent barrier. She saw her mother slump against the control panel, then slide slowly to the floor. The image burned into her memory, the peaceful expression on Jasmine's face, the way her hair spread across the clean tiles, the untouched research samples secured beside her. That moment would return to her in dreams for years, always with the same detail and the same helpless feeling. The facility never fully recovered from the incident. The research bay remained sealed for months before decontamination teams could safely enter, and even then, workers wore level 4 biohazard suits. The family's quarters grew quieter, the laughter that once filled the corridors replaced by strained silence. Jill began spending nights in the laboratory, studying his wife's notes with an intensity that frightened the children. Jasmine's sacrifice secured the future of colonization efforts. Her modified crops later proved capable of thriving in Tarnell's soil, providing sustainable nutrition for thousands of settlers. The very toxin that killed her became the key to understanding how to neutralize similar threats in other modified plants. Researchers developed countermeasures based on her final moments, creating safety protocols that prevented similar tragedies. Her death represented the brutal mathematics of frontier science. Sometimes progress demanded ultimate payment. The crops that eventually grew across Tarnell's agricultural domes carried her genetic innovations in every seed, each plant a living memorial to her work. Colonists who never knew her name consumed the bread made from her grains, unaware of the cost buried in their daily sustenance. The research samples she saved contained the blueprint for survival on dozens of hostile worlds, their genetic codes holding solutions to food scarcity problems that had plagued off-world settlements for decades. Her assistant went on to lead the planetary agricultural program, implementing every one of her final instructions with meticulous care. He never worked in a greenhouse again, preferring instead to manage operations from secured control rooms, his eyes often drifting to the emergency protocols display. Jill's hands shook as he sorted through Jasmine's research files for the third time that night. The data pads glowed softly on his desk, each containing fragments of her work that rival corporations would kill to obtain. He started checking the security feed every 15 minutes, his eyes scanning the empty corridors for intruders that never appeared. The paranoia began as protective instinct after her death, a reasonable concern for safeguarding her legacy that gradually twisted into something darker. He began hearing coded messages in routine transmissions from supply ships. Standard navigation updates became veiled threats when filtered through his grief. Visitor manifests turned into lists of potential corporate spies arriving to steal what remained of Jasmine's research. The habitat's security systems, originally designed to withstand Tarnell's predatory fauna, slowly redirected inward. Jill reprogrammed the door locks himself, adding biometric scanners that only recognized his handprint. The heavy metal doors that once protected them from sandworms and ice stalkers now sealed his daughters inside their quarters. Florence first noticed the change when her bedroom door refused to open for her morning classes. The external cameras showed nothing beyond their corridor, but Jill insisted the threat required complete lockdown. He started accompanying them to the greenhouse for mandatory exercise periods, his hand never far from the stunner on his belt. Food rationing began despite fully stocked storage units. Jill limited their meals to measured portions, claiming contaminated supplies required careful monitoring. The girls ate under his watchful eye, their hunger growing as his distrust deepened. He tested their food with chemical sensors before allowing them to eat, his movements sharp and methodical. Florence watched her father's once steady hands tremble around the testing equipment, the man who'd taught her botany now suspicious of every nutrient bar and water packet. The final breaking point came when he discovered Jasmine's personal research journal. Her handwritten notes contained speculative theories about plant-based neurotoxins that mirrored the agent that killed her. Jill saw only danger in those pages, a blueprint that could fall into wrong hands. He built a small fire in the waste disposal unit, feeding her observations into the flames sheet by sheet. The light flickered across his face as her words turned to ash, his expression rigid with what he believed was necessary protection. His actions created a prison built from love and fear in equal measure. The same instincts that should have driven him to comfort his daughters instead walled them away from anything he perceived as threat. Florence learned to recognize the specific sound of his footsteps approaching their door, the rhythm of his breathing when his suspicions peaked. Dina stopped speaking during his visits, her small body tensing whenever his shadow fell across the doorway. Jill's military training amplified the damage. He approached their protection like a siege defense, establishing patrol routes through the habitat and maintaining constant vigilance. The security system logs showed him checking environmental seals 60 times daily, his access patterns forming a map of escalating obsession. He slept in brief naps at his desk, waking abruptly to scan surveillance feeds for threats only he could see. The man who had once built tree houses for his daughters now built fortresses. The father who had taught them star navigation now limited their world to 3 sealed rooms. His love became measured in locked doors and portion-controlled meals, his grief manifesting as control where comfort was needed. Each security upgrade, each ration reduction, each burned notebook represented another layer of protection that felt increasingly like punishment. The habitat's medical sensors registered his declining health, elevated heart rate, sleep deprivation, erratic cortisol levels. The system flagged him for psychological evaluation 17 times over 6 months. He deleted the alerts without reading them, his focus entirely on external threats while the real danger grew within their sealed environment. His daughters watched him transform from protector to jailer, their silent observation documenting a collapse he refused to acknowledge. The tragedy unfolded without dramatic confrontation, just gradual suffocation under the weight of good intentions turned toxic. Jill believed he was building a sanctuary, but constructed a cage instead. Each security measure another bar between his children and the world outside. They learned to measure danger not by external threats but by the tightening grip of their father's fear, their survival increasingly dependent on escaping the very person sworn to protect them. The emergency lights pulsed a weak yellow glow across the empty triage bays, their rhythmic flickering the only movement in the entire station. Florence pushed the heavy door open with her shoulder, Dina shivering against her side as they stepped into the unnerving silence. The air carried the sterile scent of antiseptic and something else underneath, the metallic tang of abandoned electronics. Their breath fogged in the chilled air, the environmental controls struggling to maintain basic life support. Medical supplies lay scattered across treatment tables as if someone had been interrupted mid-procedure. Bandage packs sat half-opened. Diagnostic scanners remained powered on with low battery warnings, and a surgical tray held instruments arranged for a procedure that never happened. Nothing appeared looted or damaged, just abruptly abandoned. Florence noted the pattern. Valuable medications remained in their locked cabinets. Emergency rations sat untouched in storage compartments. Yet basic supplies were left out in the open. The life support panel showed deliberate sabotage rather than system failure. Someone had manually overridden the atmospheric controls, dropping temperature and oxygen levels just enough to make the station uncomfortable, but not immediately lethal. The carbon dioxide scrubbers ran at minimum capacity, while nitrogen levels rose steadily. These weren't random malfunctions. They were calculated adjustments designed to discourage investigation while maintaining structural integrity. No staff members remained, but evidence of their sudden departure appeared everywhere. A steaming mug of tea sat cooling on a console, its warmth suggesting the drink had been made recently. Personal lockers stood open with jackets still hanging inside, and a pair of reading glasses rested atop an unfinished report. The station log showed the last entry was 72 hours earlier, a routine systems check that ended mid-sentence. Subsequent attempts to access the log required security clearances that no longer functioned. The communications array had been physically disabled from the inside. Florence found the main panel open with its wiring deliberately severed in multiple places. The cuts were clean and precise, made with professional tools rather than rushed violence. Someone who knew the system well had ensured no signals could enter or leave the station, creating perfect radio silence. The emergency beacon had been removed entirely, its mounting brackets sitting empty beside the console. While searching for functional equipment, Florence's fingers brushed against a cold metal rectangle tucked beneath the comms console. She pulled out a standard access card unlike any she'd seen before. Jet black with no identification markings, just a single silver stripe along one edge. The card felt heavier than normal, its edges slightly sharper. When she held it near a door reader, the lock clicked open without the usual authorization chime. The station's power distribution told its own story. Non-essential systems were completely shut down, while medical freezers and emergency lighting drew from backup generators. This selective power allocation required manual configuration. The automated systems would have maintained full operation or triggered complete shutdown. Someone had taken the time to choose which system survived and which went dark, preserving critical functions while creating the appearance of abandonment. The evidence pointed to a carefully staged disappearance. Personal items left behind created the impression of sudden emergency, while the systematic disabling of communications and environmental controls suggested planned isolation. The medical station hadn't been overwhelmed by some external threat. It had been deliberately closed and quarantined from within. The scattered supplies were theater, the failing life support a calculated deterrent. Whoever remained here wanted visitors to assume the station was dead and keep moving. They'd created the perfect ghost facility, empty enough to discourage exploration but functional enough to serve some hidden purpose. The access card in Florence's hand felt suddenly heavy with implication. Either someone had left it for a specific visitor, or they'd accidentally dropped their key to this carefully constructed isolation. The station's silence wasn't absence, it was a performance, and they just stepped onto the stage. Kay's medical scanner cast an amber glow across Dina's small frame, the light tracing the sharp lines of her ribs through the thin fabric of her survival suit. The device hummed softly as it mapped her vital signs, its readouts painting a grim picture of systemic collapse. Her core temperature registered at 29 degrees, deep into stage 3 hypothermia where organs begin shutting down to preserve brain function. The scanner flagged cardiac irregularity and renal stress, her body sacrificing extremities to protect vital systems. Malnutrition showed in the detailed bone density scan. The cortical thickness measurement fell well below healthy parameters for her age, the marrow struggling to produce sufficient red blood cells. Muscle mass had deteriorated to emergency levels, her body consuming its own tissue for energy. Ka noted the specific pattern of atrophy, particularly severe in the legs and back muscles, indicating prolonged calorie deficit combined with physical stress. The scan estimated she'd lost nearly 30% of her body weight over the previous months. The frostbite damage appeared most clearly on her left foot. 2 toes showed complete tissue death, the blackened digits contrasting sharply with the pale blue skin surrounding them. The scanner detected no blood flow below the second metatarsal, the necrosis extending partially into the foot itself. Ka made a mental note of the surgical equipment she'd need for amputation before infection set in. The other toes showed varying degrees of damage, from superficial redness to deeper tissue involvement. Florence's examination revealed parallel deterioration. Dehydration showed in her sunken eyes and poor skin turgor, her body having exhausted its fluid reserves days earlier. Her muscle enzymes indicated severe breakdown from continuous exertion without recovery. The scanner detected elevated stress hormones at sustained levels that would overwhelm most adults, her system functioning in permanent crisis mode. She maintained consciousness through sheer determination, her body running on willpower rather than physiological reserves. Both girls exhibited classic signs of prolonged psychological trauma. Their cortisol levels remained dangerously elevated even in relative safety, the adrenal systems unable to downregulate after constant activation. Brain activity scans showed hypervigilance patterns typically seen in combat veterans, their neural pathways rewired for continuous threat assessment. Florence's grip on her sister's hand never relaxed, her muscles locked in protective tension despite medical sedation. Kay maintained her professional demeanor while assembling treatment protocols. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency as she prepared warm intravenous fluids and nutritional supplements, but her eyes kept returning to the scanner's worst findings. The medication dosages she calculated were borderline aggressive, tailored for patients much closer to death than recovery. She adjusted the environmental controls to raise the room temperature gradually, aware that rapid warming could trigger fatal cardiovascular stress. The medical assessment confirmed what their appearance had suggested. They'd reached the absolute edge of survivability. Another hour outside would have pushed Dina into irreversible organ failure. Another few hours would have collapsed Florence's exhausted systems completely. Their survival represented less a triumph of endurance than a narrow avoidance of inevitable death. The evidence of neglect showed in every measurement. The specific nutritional deficiencies matched limited diets rather than starvation conditions. The bone thinning indicated chronic undersupply rather than acute crisis. The frostbite patterns suggested inadequate footwear over extended periods, not brief exposure during emergency. The psychological markers pointed to sustained trauma in what should have been a secure environment. Kay finished her initial treatment protocol and stepped back to observe her patients. The steady beep of the heart monitor marked a fragile stabilization, each tone representing a temporary victory against overwhelming odds. She began preparing surgical instruments for the necessary amputations, her movements precise despite the anger tightening her shoulders. The medical facts required focus, but the human story behind those numbers would linger long after treatment ended. The engine's roar cut through the storm's howl before the vehicle itself became visible, a deep-throated grinding that vibrated through the station's metal flooring. Jill's modified crawler tore through the snowdrifts with violent purpose, its treads churning ice into spray that glittered in its forward lights. The machine moved with a jerky, aggressive motion that suggested the driver's state of mind more clearly than any visual. It didn't slow as it approached the station, instead accelerating toward the main entrance with clear intent to breach. His comms channel blasted across all frequencies, overwhelming emergency bands with distorted audio fragments. Jasmine's last transmission played on loop but corrupted, her calm instructions twisted into static-laced panic, her final words stretched and broken into something unrecognizable. Between these fragments came bursts of raw interference that spiked the audio monitors, a calculated jamming that prevented any outgoing communication. The effect was disorienting, a sonic assault that made rational thought difficult. The crawler itself showed extensive field modifications. Welded steel plates covered the cockpit glass except for narrow slits, reducing visibility but creating near-impenetrable armor. Mounted on the front bumper, an industrial-grade plasma cutter had been repurposed as a weapon, its power lines running directly to the main engine. The treads featured sharpened ice cleats that dug deep into the frozen ground, giving the vehicle unnatural traction in conditions that should have immobilized it. Every modification spoke of careful planning executed with desperate urgency. Kay recognized the specific pattern of medication-resistant psychosis in his approach. The relentless advance without tactical caution, the overwhelming audio assault, the vehicle modifications prioritizing offense over defense. These weren't the actions of a rational mind, however disturbed. She'd seen this presentation before in frontier settlers whose treatment protocols failed, their psychosis hardening into something that resisted both medication and reason. The condition created a terrifying combination of strategic thinking divorced from moral constraints. Paradoxically, the storm that nearly killed the girls now became their protection. The whiteout conditions limited visibility to mere meters, reducing Jill's modified crawler to blundering through near-zero visibility. The howling wind drowned out much of his engine noise, giving the station some warning but masking their exact position. Ice accumulation already weighed down his vehicle's external sensors, their effectiveness decreasing with each passing minute in the brutal conditions. His tracking methods revealed unnerving precision despite the obstacles. The crawler moved directly toward the station's weakest structural point, a maintenance entrance with lighter shielding than the main doors. He bypassed obvious approaches for ones that suggested intimate knowledge of the facility's vulnerabilities. His progress showed no hesitation or course correction, just relentless movement toward his target, with the certainty of someone following a well-memorized blueprint. Jill knew this terrain with the deep familiarity of someone who'd mapped every ridge and crevasse. His route took advantage of ice bridges that appeared unstable but held his weight, followed wind-scoured pathways invisible to sensors, and navigated using landmarks that barely rose above the drifting snow. This knowledge, combined with his military training, made him more formidable than any natural threat the planet could offer. The environment that tested everyone else became his weapon and his shield. His madness amplified rather than diminished his capabilities. The psychosis sharpened his focus to a razor edge, eliminating hesitation and doubt while heightening his survival instincts. He operated with the single-minded purpose of someone who believed his actions were not just justified, but necessary. This conviction, combined with his skills and knowledge, created an opponent more dangerous than any rational actor. The storm that hampered him also fueled his determination, the external chaos matching his internal state. The crawler reached the station's perimeter, the plasma cutter flaring to life with a blue-white glare that cut through the blowing snow. The weapon began tracing a burning line across the maintenance door, molten metal dripping onto the frozen ground. Each movement was economical and precise, the work of someone who knew exactly where to cut for maximum effect. The station's defenses, designed against external threats, had never anticipated an assault from someone with full knowledge of their weaknesses. Kay studied the ice tunnel's structural map under the dim glow of her wrist light. The underground passages showed stress fractures from generations of mining operations, their weaknesses carefully documented in abandoned survey reports. One support beam in particular caught her attention, a carbon steel reinforcement that had developed microfractures during Tarnell's last seismic event. The damage appeared minor on initial scans but created a critical vulnerability in the tunnel network. She calculated the precise amount of explosive needed to compromise that single beam, without triggering a complete collapse. The shaped charges came from the station's emergency demolition kit, designed for controlled structural work rather than combat. Ka placed them with surgical precision around the fractured beam, her fingers working quickly in the freezing air. She configured the blast pattern to direct energy inward, focusing the explosion toward the weakest point. The charges contained just enough force to break the beam's integrity, but not enough to shatter the surrounding ice walls. Each placement represented careful calculation rather than desperation. Her objective was obstruction, not destruction. The planned collapse would create a debris field of broken ice and metal that no vehicle could navigate, while leaving sufficient space for air to filter through. She measured the tunnel dimensions and calculated the likely fall pattern, ensuring the rubble would form a barrier rather than a solid wall. The design allowed sound to carry through the gaps, providing auditory warning of any attempt to clear the blockage. Jill's modified crawler presented specific challenges. The vehicle's reinforced treads could handle rough terrain, but couldn't climb over sharp, unstable debris. The plasma cutter required stable footing to operate effectively, something the collapsed tunnel wouldn't provide. Ka positioned the charges to drop material that would wedge beneath the crawler's chassis, immobilizing it without crushing the cockpit. The collapse would trap rather than destroy, disable rather than kill. The explosion echoed through the tunnel network with a deep, resonating thump that traveled through rock and ice rather than air. The sound continued for 10 full minutes as settling debris found new equilibrium, a continuous grinding rumble that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Dust clouds billowed through adjacent passages, carrying the sharp scent of fractured minerals and oxidized metal. The girls covered their ears against the overwhelming noise, their faces pale in the flickering emergency lights. When the dust settled, the tunnel behind them had transformed into a landscape of broken ice chunks and twisted reinforcement bars. The debris formed a steep slope that rose nearly to the ceiling, its surface too unstable for climbing yet porous enough for air exchange. Small openings between the rubble pieces allowed limited visibility through the barrier, creating sightlines that served both as warning system and psychological pressure. Kay checked her atmospheric reader. Oxygen levels remained stable, confirming the collapse had preserved ventilation pathways. The temperature held constant, indicating the thermal seals in adjacent sections remained intact. Every measurement confirmed the demolition had achieved exactly what she intended, a functional barrier that maintained life support throughout the tunnel network. The emergency lights on their side continued operating, while those on Jill's side flickered from disrupted power lines. The time gained was measured in hours rather than days, but provided critical advantage. Jill would need specialized equipment to clear the debris safely, equipment he couldn't have brought on the crawler. Any attempt to dig through manually would risk secondary collapses from the unstable pile. The barrier created a psychological hurdle as well as physical one, forcing delay and reconsideration rather than immediate pursuit. Even in extreme circumstances, Ka maintained her professional ethics. The demolition preserved the possibility of Jill's survival and eventual recovery. She'd chosen a path that protected her charges without sacrificing their pursuer, a decision that reflected her dual role as medic and protector. The explosive placement showed restraint where others might have chosen annihilation, the careful calibration speaking to deeper principles than mere survival. The tunnels fell into uneasy silence after the collapse, the only sounds coming from dripping meltwater and settling ice. Ka listened for several minutes, her head tilted toward the barrier as she monitored for any sign of movement beyond. Her expression remained neutral, but her shoulders relaxed slightly when no immediate attempt at breakthrough occurred. She turned to the girls and gestured toward the deeper tunnels, her movements calm despite the urgency of their situation. The mining passages bore the scars of generations past, their walls marked by the mechanical teeth of excavation drones that had chewed through solid rock. Deep grooves ran in parallel lines where cutting blades had bitten deep, while blast marks from controlled demolitions spread like dark spiderwebs across the ceiling. The stone held impressions of tool handles worn smooth by countless hands, and in places, faint chalk markings still suggested long-forgotten directions. These tunnels remembered the miners who had worked them, their presence lingering in the very rock they'd shaped. Florence ran her fingers along a particularly deep set of tool marks, her mother's voice echoing in memory. Jasmine had taught her to read terrain like pages in a book, to see the story written in stone and ice. She remembered standing with her in these very passages years earlier, learning to identify stable rock from fracture-prone sections by the sound it made when tapped. Those lessons returned now as she studied the ceiling for stress fractures, her ears tuned for the specific ring that indicated solid foundation. Some tunnels terminated without warning at sheer drops into blackness. Ka tested each new passage by dropping a glow stick into the darkness, watching its fall until it disappeared into depths that swallowed light completely. Other pathways narrowed to impassable cracks or ended in collapsed sections where rockfalls had sealed them decades earlier. They backtracked twice when tunnels that appeared promising turned into dead ends, their time dwindling with each wrong turn. They navigated by air currents rather than visible paths. Florence wet her finger and held it up to detect the faintest movement of air, following the flow toward ventilation sources. Dina's breathing provided another guide. When her inhalations grew labored, they knew oxygen levels were dropping. Ka monitored the girls' respiratory patterns with professional attention, using them as a living atmospheric sensor. The deeper they went, the more they relied on these subtle indicators over visible markers. Kay left a trail of subtle indicators for any rescue teams that might follow. She scratched small arrows at knee height where passages diverged, using a pattern known to frontier medical personnel. At each major junction, she placed a sterile bandage wrapper, white against the dark rock, oriented toward their chosen path. These markers would be meaningless to anyone without training, but would stand out to search teams familiar with emergency protocols. The tunnels seemed to shift around them as the storm raged overhead. Deep vibrations traveled through the rock, making dust sift down from ceilings and small pebbles skitter across floors. The sound was a constant low rumble that felt more like pressure than noise, a physical presence in the confined spaces. At times, the walls appeared to move in the flickering light of their lamps, optical illusions created by the unstable illumination and constant vibration. Their progress became a blend of skill and instinct. Ka's technical knowledge of tunnel construction combined with Florence's innate understanding of the terrain, while Dina's physical responses provided critical environmental data. They moved as a single organism, each contributing specialized awareness to their shared survival. The usual distinctions between leader and follower blurred in the constant negotiation of their path. The underground world felt watchful in a way that went beyond imagination. Shadows moved at the edge of their light beams, retreating when directly illuminated. Sounds echoed from side tunnels that shouldn't contain anything capable of making noise. Once, a cascade of pebbles fell behind them minutes after they'd passed, though no one had touched the walls. The sensation of being observed grew stronger the deeper they traveled, an unshakable feeling that their passage was noted by something ancient and patient in the darkness. They found their rhythm in the constant assessment of risk and opportunity. Each choice carried weight, A wrong turn could waste precious energy or lead to catastrophe, while the correct path might bring them closer to safety. The pressure created a strange clarity where every detail mattered, every sound carried meaning, every decision felt monumental. They became part of the tunnel's history themselves, leaving their own story written in footprints and dropped bandage wrappers for some future traveler to find. The psychiatric evaluation began with restraint straps and sedation, Jill's eyes tracking the doctors with animal wariness. His psychosis orbited a fixed point, preserving Jasmine's legacy at any cost. He believed corporate spies would extract her research from their daughter's very DNA, viewing their genetic material as living storage devices rather than children. This conviction hardened into unshakable reality, despite antipsychotic medications that should have diminished such fixations. The medical team adjusted dosages and combinations for weeks with limited effect, his belief system resisting chemical intervention. Moments of heartbreaking clarity broke through the paranoia. He'd suddenly recognized the hospital room instead of seeing an interrogation chamber, his hands trembling as he described locking the girls in their quarters. These episodes lasted minutes at most, ending with tearful apologies that dissolved back into suspicion. Doctors recorded him sobbing for what he'd done to his daughters, his voice cracking with genuine remorse before the darkness reclaimed him. These flashes of lucidity provided both hope and complication, proof of recoverable personality beneath the psychosis. His military training amplified the danger exponentially. The systematic approach to securing the habitat, the strategic rationing of supplies, the modification of vehicles, these reflected tactical thinking applied to pathological ends. He'd structured their imprisonment with field manual precision, creating security protocols that would have been commendable in combat conditions. This technical competence made his breakdown far more dangerous than simple madness. Combining strategic intelligence with delusional purpose, medical examination revealed chemical burns on his hands and forearms. Toxic residue matched the very plants Jasmine had been studying, indicating he'd been attempting to recreate her work alone in the habitat's lab. The burns showed repeated exposure over months, suggesting trial and error experimentation without proper protective equipment. This physical evidence explained his deteriorating mental state. Neurotoxin exposure had likely accelerated and deepened his psychosis. Beyond typical traumatic response, his madness represented devotion twisted into destruction. Every locked door, every rationed meal, every burned notebook originated from his desire to protect what remained of his wife. The evaluation showed how love had curdled into obsession, how grief had mutated into paranoia. His mind had constructed an elaborate fortress around Jasmine's memory, imprisoning everyone who came near it. The tragedy lay in recognizing that the same intensity that made him a devoted husband now made him a dangerous father. Treatment required separating factual memory from traumatic distortion. Doctors used Jasmine's actual research notes, recovered from backup systems, to contrast with Jill's distorted memories. They showed him security footage of normal supply shipments to counter his corporate espionage theories. The process progressed inch by inch, each fact requiring meticulous verification against his paranoid narratives. His military background helped here too. He responded better to evidence presented like intelligence briefings than therapeutic dialogue. The evaluation painted a portrait of a mind broken by love rather than destroyed by malice. His actions, however monstrous, sprang from the same protective instincts that once made him a good father and husband. The challenge became preserving those core qualities, while dismantling the pathological structures he'd built around them. Doctors focused on reinforcing his moments of clarity, using those windows of rationality to anchor his treatment. His recovery would be measured in small recognitions, first of his surroundings, then of his actions, finally of their consequences. The journey back would take longer than the descent, each step requiring him to confront what his love had become. The man who believed he was protecting his family would have to face what that protection actually cost, and learn to love them in ways that didn't require locks and ration packs. The treatment room became another tunnel, this one leading back toward the person he'd been before grief rewired his mind. Amanda's arrival at the Earth consulate carried the scent of distant rain and ozone from a recent shuttle landing. She placed her identification documents on the counter with hands that showed the same long fingers and careful movements as her sister. Along with the custody paperwork, she provided genetic verification. Not just standard relationship proof, but full genomic sequencing that confirmed her connection to the girls beyond any doubt. The documents included historical family records going back 3 generations, each page bearing official seals from Earth's Immigration Bureau. Her application contained every required form, each line filled with precise economical script. Earth authorities noted her sudden appearance with professional skepticism. She'd arrived on the first civilian transport after the emergency alert went out, her timing too perfect for coincidence. Security scans showed no recent travel history to Tarnell or any frontier world, yet she spoke with specific knowledge of conditions there. Her background check revealed a botanist with advanced degrees in genetic modification, her expertise mirroring Jasmine's exactly. The questions came politely at first, then with increasing directness as inconsistencies emerged. She'd been monitoring the family since Jasmine's death through secure channels. Private security reports filled her datapad, monthly updates on the girl's health, habitat conditions, and Jill's deteriorating mental state. She'd hired observers who posed as supply runners and maintenance technicians, their reports painting a gradually darkening picture. Each document was time-stamped and geolocated, creating a detailed record of her silent vigilance. She'd known about the lockdowns, the rationing, the increasing paranoia, but jurisdictional boundaries had prevented intervention until now. Amanda possessed complete copies of the research Jill had destroyed. Her datapad contained not just Jasmine's final notes, but every experiment, every observation, every speculative theory from the beginning of her work. She'd maintained remote backups without Jasmine's knowledge, automatically syncing data during their weekly communications. The files showed meticulous organization, cross-referenced, indexed, and annotated with Amanda's own observations. This represented years of collaborative thinking preserved against all destruction. Her botanical background gave the research context and credibility. She could explain Jasmine's methodology, replicate her experiments, and articulate the theoretical foundations behind each modification. When officials questioned specific technical aspects, she provided detailed explanations that matched the original research notes exactly. Her hands moved with the same precision Jasmine's had when describing plant structures and genetic sequences. The familiarity went beyond academic knowledge into deeply personal understanding. She offered to destroy everything if it meant securing the girl's safety. The datapad containing years of groundbreaking research lay on the table between them, its value incalculable to the scientific community. She stated plainly that she would wipe its memory and physically break the device if required. The offer wasn't negotiation tactic but sincere declaration. The research mattered only if it didn't endanger her family. Her fingers rested on the device's erase command, waiting for the response. Her determination stemmed from years of regret over not intervening sooner. She spoke of missed opportunities to extract the family before Jill's psychosis took full hold, of legal barriers she should have challenged more aggressively. The guilt showed in the way she held herself too still, the control that couldn't quite mask the tension beneath. She'd watched the situation deteriorate from light years away, each report another weight on her conscience. This rescue attempt represented atonement as much as intervention. She embodied the family support system they should have had all along. Her presence offered stability without conditions, protection without imprisonment, care without control. The girls watched her with uncertain recognition, seeing echoes of their mother in her face and movements. She didn't try to replace what they'd lost, but instead represented what remained. A connection to someone who shared their history without the trauma attached. Her risk balanced rescue against redemption. Every action carried personal and professional consequences, from the research she might destroy to the legal battles she might ignite. She moved forward anyway, choosing family over legacy, people over progress. The choice reflected a value system that prioritized human connection above all else, a principle that had guided her silent monitoring and now drove her open intervention. She stood ready to sacrifice everything Jasmine had built to protect what Jasmine had loved most. Earth's gravity felt like wading through deep water at first, every movement requiring unexpected effort against a force their bodies had unlearned. The girls walked with a heavy, deliberate pace, their muscles straining against a pull that seemed to drag at their bones. Doctors called it gravitational shock, their system struggling to recalibrate after a lifetime in Tarnell's lighter pull. They moved through the rehabilitation facility like deep-sea divers navigating an unfamiliar ocean floor, each step a conscious effort. Their skin began changing within days of arrival. The distinctive blue pigmentation faded toward a soft turquoise, then took on a greenish cast as their bodies ceased filtering toxins. The transformation wasn't uniform. Patches of color lingered around scars and joints, creating a mottled map of their adaptation. Medical scanners showed the mineral compounds slowly dispersing from subcutaneous layers, the biological filtration system powering down for the first time in their lives. The change felt both foreign and familiar, their bodies remembering an ancestral genetic memory of Earth's environment. Doctors monitored their respiratory adaptation with careful attention. Breathing unfiltered air caused initial irritation, their lungs reacting to pollen, pollutants, and microorganisms that Tarnell's filtration systems would have removed. They developed mild coughs and nasal congestion as their mucosal linings learned to handle Earth's complex atmospheric cocktail. Pulmonary function tests showed gradual improvement as their alveoli expanded to process richer oxygen levels. The transition measured in steady percentage points on medical readouts. Sensory overload became a constant challenge. Colors appeared unnaturally vibrant after Tarnell's limited spectrum of ice and rock. Florence found herself staring at green vegetation for minutes, her eyes struggling to process the intensity of chlorophyll-rich leaves. Sounds carried layers of complexity absent from their sterile habitat. Birdsong, distant traffic, rainfall on roofs. They started wearing tinted glasses indoors and ear protection outdoors, their neural pathways requiring time to filter Earth's abundant stimuli. Muscle pain became a constant companion as their bodies fought lighter gravity. Their legs ached from overcompensating for expected resistance that never came. Their backs strained from standing straighter than necessary. Physical therapists guided them through exercises designed to retrain their proprioception, teaching them to move with the economy of energy that Earth's gravity allowed. The soreness reflected not damage but recalibration, their musculoskeletal system rewriting its operating parameters. Florence's frostbite scars tingled with returning nerve function. The damaged tissue registered new sensations as blood flow increased and neural connections re-established themselves. The feeling started as occasional pins and needles, then progressed to intermittent warmth spreading through previously numb areas. Medical imaging showed capillary regeneration and nerve sheath development, the body repairing damage that had seemed permanent. Each tingle marked another small reclamation of what cold had taken. Their adaptation reflected deeper biological memory than anyone anticipated. DNA analysis revealed epigenetic markers activating that hadn't functioned on Tarnell, ancient genetic instructions for Earth survival awakening after generations of dormancy. Their circadian rhythms synchronized with Earth's rotation within days rather than weeks, their hormone production adjusting to seasonal light changes. The body remembered what the mind had never known, ancestral programming guiding their physical transition. The psychological adjustment mirrored the physical. They dreamed of open skies and uncontrolled weather, their subconscious processing environments beyond enclosed habitats. Florence found herself touching trees and soil with unconscious reverence, her fingers tracing patterns in bark and earth that felt fundamentally right. Dina began collecting fallen leaves and feathers, building tiny arrangements that spoke to some deep need for connection with living systems. Their trauma remained, but beneath it stirred older memories of belonging. Earth became both sanctuary and challenge, a world that should have been home but felt alien in its abundance. They learned to appreciate safety without confinement, to experience freedom without constant threat. The journey from blue-skinned survivors to Earth-adapted residents happened gradually, each small adjustment layering into fundamental transformation. Their bodies led the way, remembering what their minds were still learning, how to live in a world that didn't constantly try to kill them. The package arrived with forensic seals still intact, each security strip bearing the official mark of the psychiatric facility's screening committee. Medical staff performed one final toxin scan at the receiving desk, the handheld device humming over every surface of the plain cardboard box. They checked for psychological triggers too, any imagery, scents, or materials that might provoke traumatic recall. Only after clearing both inspections did the package reach the girls' quarters, its contents carrying the weight of careful consideration rather than impulsive gesture. For Dina, he'd sourced a biocanner matching Jasmine's original model. The device felt familiar in her small hands, its weight and balance identical to the tool her mother had used during greenhouse inspections. The screen showed the same soft green glow, the same gentle hum during operation. This wasn't current technology, but deliberately chosen nostalgia. A connection to happier times before everything went wrong. Dina's fingers traced the calibration dials with unconscious familiarity, her body remembering movements her mind had nearly forgotten. Florence received her mother's journal, its leather cover still bearing the slight warp from greenhouse humidity. Missing pages had been meticulously restored using backup scans, the new sheets carefully aged to match the original paper. Jasmine's handwriting filled every page with observations about plant genetics and soil chemistry, but also with personal notes about her daughter's development. In the margins were small doodles of flowers with the girls' names beneath them. Moments of motherhood preserved between scientific notations. The data chips contained recovered research files Jill had tried to destroy. Specialists had reconstructed the data from fragmented storage systems, retrieving years of work that should have been lost forever. The files included not just Jasmine's final experiments, but her early theoretical work, showing the evolution of her thinking over time. Each chip bore a small label in Jill's improving handwriting, brief descriptions of contents and dates of recovery. The gesture represented both apology and restoration, an attempt to give back what he'd taken away. Handwritten notes accompanied each item, the penmanship showing gradual improvement over weeks of practice. The letters started shaky and oversized, then grew more controlled as his medication stabilized. He didn't make excuses or ask forgiveness, simply stated what each object represented and why he'd chosen it. The paper carried the faint scent of hospital antiseptic and the earthy smell of the rehabilitation garden where he wrote them. Each note ended with the same phrase, "Thinking of you always." Doctors monitored the girl's reactions through one-way glass, noting physiological responses alongside emotional ones. Dina's heart rate remained steady as she examined the biocanner, her breathing even. Florence's hands trembled slightly when she first touched the journal, but she didn't pull away. They observed how long the girl spent with each item, what features they examined first, whether they shared their discoveries with each other. The preliminary assessment showed cautious engagement rather than traumatic triggering. The gifts measured his recovery in tangible increments. Each represented hours of therapeutic work to reach the clarity required for such choices. The items showed he remembered what mattered to them, understood what had been lost, and recognized how to begin rebuilding. The thought behind each selection revealed more progress than any psychiatric evaluation could capture. His doctors noted the timing coincided with his first unsupervised privileges. The packages sent immediately after he earned limited independence. These careful offerings built connections where direct communication still faltered. The objects spoke when words remained too difficult, carrying meanings too complex for early reconciliation. They created neutral territory, where relationship could regrow without immediate pressure of face-to-face interaction. The girls could accept the gifts without accepting the giver yet, examining what was offered without confronting who offered it. The space between giving and receiving became their meeting ground. Jill's recovery would be measured in such gestures long before words became possible. The packages represented his understanding that some damage required patient rebuilding, rather than dramatic repair. Each item carried specific meaning tailored to its recipient, showing he saw them as individuals with distinct needs and memories. The care and selection contradicted the carelessness of his actions during breakdown, each thoughtful choice silently arguing against his past behavior. The gifts became his first language of apology, spoken through objects when words still failed him.